It's just great to see so many of you here tonight to listen to Mike talk. I should probably just say that, well, you can all see where the exit is, so I'll get that. Wait, and when we have questions, there's a little square that's going to go round, so it's not like a microphone, but I'm sure you will work out how to use it. We tried in this year's Architecture Week to have lots of different events going on, and I think it's really great to have the actual president talk, because we always have other people come and talk. I think it's about time that sort of local architects started speaking. So Mike Waddington then, he's going to he has been, well, I was going to say been not quite forced into this, but it's going to be a personal reflection, but he reflects on the work of his practice, how it's evolving, and the challenges of designing contemporary architecture that respects its physical, cultural and historical context. Thisness is a term coined by the great townscape pioneer Gordon Cullen, as he saw modernist architecture stripping away character and complexity from our town and cities. It reflects what makes buildings fit, their context, and enhance our sense of place. Mike's talk will cover the importance of context and historic resonance, the value of complexity, what happened to symbolism in design, and challenges of large-scale development, why innovation matters, and how well-being is generated in the introduction to the 2021 Island Identity consultation document. A key finding was of a widespread feeling that something is being lost. Could this be the same stripping away of character and complexity that something is being lost? Could this be the same stripping away of character and complexity that Cullen warned of? Let's have the discussion. Thank you, Mike.
Thanks, Alison. I've got a feeling that was written when Stuart and I were going to be doing a joint talk, so my topic is slightly different today. But good evening, everybody, and thank you for coming. As you know, I was originally going to be sharing this talk with Stuart Fell, but reluctantly he had to pull out because he's way too busy due to work pressures. So this is really a very personal presentation of some of my thinking around architecture and the ideas that I'm curious about. By the way, the font here is called Tapeworm and was created by the great American artist Ed Ruscha. He likes words and I do too. I love the enigmatic combination of his words and images. Words that are bigger than mountains or the sky, and have this kind of curious resemblance, obviously, to the famous Hollywood sign. Ed Ruscha's famous gas station paintings, everyday words as part of everyday architecture. They seem to fit together so well. Is this an obesity warning? Maybe. Or is Ed Ruscha referring to the atomic bomb dropped on Nagasaki that was nicknamed Fat Boy? This is on Blackpool Pier. And this is in Manchester. Gordon Cullen, as Alison said, I think the great townscape genius, he understood the effect of words on our buildings and streetscapes and the power they could impact. Jersey too has got a rich heritage of words on buildings. I think we should bring this tradition back, maybe modernise it a bit. These are little models I made that mix words with architectural ideas. Gordon Cullen also coined the term thisness. It's the idea of typicality, or a thing being itself. Character, really, I suppose. So I'd like to start this talk with a postcard, which seems to be on topic for Architecture Week. It's from my sister, who was on holiday in Vienna earlier this year. This is the Hundertwasser, if you don't know it, housing development, where the residents are invited to personalise their houses. I genuinely think a few years ago I'd probably have hated this, but now I sort of enjoy its quirkiness, informality, colours. It reminds me of Peter Barber's Spiral Tower drawing, which I think is amazing. And maybe a little bit of Monsieur Hulot's flat in the film Mon Oncle, which, if you haven't seen, is fantastic, and in terms of how you circulate around a building to get into your flat is just so funny. There's a richness here, the kind of thing that nails you to a place, as the great Ian Nairn once said. This is Wang Shu's Contemporary Art Museum in Ningbo in China, which was built in 2005. From the year 2000 until 2010, as China modernized, an average of 250 villages were demolished every single day, which is extraordinary. Wang Shu brilliantly built the museum from salvage, from the lost villages. Salvage and memory all neatly stacked. A small idea, but with a really big message. Here's a cathedral wall in Valencia with its own story to tell. And a wall in the Jewish quarter in Krakow with fragments of gravestones embedded in it. A much sadder story. And here we've got granite chippings for voussoirs and coins, 19th century salvage in St Helier. This was the inspiration for us developing Bottle Dash, a recycled glass chip rendering system. And here's Ann Street Brewery. Its rear facade bears the scars of past eras, really. And I think it's got something to do with us losing something when we sanitize every development, when everything just becomes too new. And maybe I'm just getting a bit nostalgic as I get older, but I think there's a quality and a patina to some of these buildings that aren't necessarily particularly beautiful, but there's something there, I think, that is worth preserving or reflecting upon. And on a smaller scale, this is in London. It's called House of Trace by Tsurutu Architects. And you can see past eras framed by new architecture, deliberately keeping the old gable as a kind of memory of what was there before. And fantastically, the steps to the garden don't touch the ground. I love that. Okay, this is Goya's 1808 painting, the 3rd of May, commemorating Spanish resistance to Napoleon's armies in the Peninsular War. 3 years earlier, in 1805, the Spanish and French navies had combined forces but lost to the British at the Battle of Trafalgar. We were asked to look at a housing project on Dorset Street in the heart of St Helier's wonderful lanes. It turns out that a Spanish lieutenant colonel, Ignacio de Orellana, I think you pronounce it, veteran of the same Spanish Peninsular War, lived in a cottage in Dorset Street and raised a family there. Military officers of all kinds used to retire to Jersey on half pay, attracted by the tax regime, the mild climate, and the island way of life. By coincidence, William Harrison, a retired seaman and veteran of the Battle of Trafalgar, lived just round the corner in Columbus Street. I wonder if they ever met. Still on a Spanish theme, there are similarities between St Helier's narrow lanes and lots of typical Spanish villages. I really like their narrowness and ornamentation. I also like their vertical proportions, punched windows, contrasting colours, and decorative tiles. So when we were asked to prepare a scheme on Columbus Street, many of these ideas sparked our design thinking. Vertical proportions, decorative tiles, salvage in the walls and planters, layering and a little complexity in the private balconies, memory and a feeling of movement. Now this really is going to be hard to pronounce, but Zenon Świętoszwajski is recorded as living at 13 Dorset Street in 1841, just round the corner from the two retired military men. A Polish revolutionary, he immigrated to Jersey via France to escape persecution for his socialist beliefs. He ran a photography studio until he was exiled from Jersey in 1855, alongside Victor Hugo and about 40 other people living in Jersey. He's buried in Green Street Cemetery. As well as an homage to Panther Hudspeth's work, the Green Street Cemetery gravestones just opposite the site inspired the facade design at the Limes. You can see the proportions that we derive from those. We developed a colour palette from the surrounding areas and found lots of contextual clues. It was also reassuring that a large building, Maison Saint-Marcouf, once occupied the site. The Limes steps up to its prominent corner site location, but it also steps in and out, which was quite challenging in terms of the technical drawings that needed to be done, but we wanted to somehow break the massing up. We were lucky to be gifted some public land in front of the site. That allowed us to plant mature, proper trees in Mother Earth, so they would mature properly, eventually mature and soften the development. Designing tall modern buildings is challenging in Jersey. We picked up on the idea of using colour, varied materials, and a vertical grain to break down the overall massing. As part of our percentage for art, we referenced the former Eastern Railway that emerged from Snow Hill and ran along the edge of the site. So you can see there are sort of railway tracks and seating there at the bottom. We also incorporated salvage into the landscape around where the seats are. The shared courtyard also referenced the long-gone Eastern Railway. Trying to keep a sense of masonry walls with punched openings, windows. Distressed encaustic tiles from Spain, of course. I remember getting the call. These tiles, they do look distressed. They're grubby by design. Kind of like the idea of putting something in a building that wasn't brand new every time. And so we inevitably got the call from Rock, site agent, to say, have you seen these tiles? I don't think they're new. And we said that's the idea, but I honestly don't think they really thought we were serious. And then factory-made clip-on balconies. We worked closely with local artist Glenn Fox as another part of our Percentage for Art adventure. Glenn worked with local school children in a series of workshops. They were encouraged to reflect on our identity as a community and where they found beauty in their surroundings. They chose the theme, simple things which we should be grateful for, which I thought was really nice. And Glenn then based his artworks on drawings they produced around that theme. These are the much-loved renovated historic cottages on Hugh Street. And I don't know if you've ever been inside the courtyard there. You can get into it through one of these red gates. It's not locked. So how small is small? Well, there's a super compact world hidden there, the width of a sash window. Clearly well looked after and enjoyed by its residents. Density and intimate living are a good thing, I think. So can we learn from this, maybe? Tranquil Place, I love the name, is another intimate shared place in St Helier. Might there be benefits from creating more tightly knit communities in town? The Pocket Mews on Albert Street. We could maybe learn from the past without copying it. Gordon Cullen's, again, drawing shows how much we enjoy squeezing through tight spaces into open ones. And our sketch shows a new Mews development on Devonshire Place that we had been working on. We imagined compact courtyards with Mews houses and duplexes and private roof terraces. Yes, you might see your neighbour, but you won't be lonely. You might even end up being friends. In part inspired by Tranquil Place on Clearview Street, we're calling this Tranquil Mews, and there's a model of it at the back of the room. Quirky tree-filled spaces and splashes of colour and ornamentation. Every home has its own front door. So you're not squeezing down corridors or from a basement up a lift down corridors. You have your own front door, either on the street or within the Mews. And a small cafe animates the shared space, rather like Locks on Pitt Street. Sorry, I'm going to try and do something that's... Bear with me, folks. So, sculpted to keep the modest massing down lowest at the edges. There are opportunities for thoughtful detailing in metalwork, brick and tiling. And we just kind of wanted to get a feel for how this would feel. Most of the residential accommodation is generally above ground floor for the living accommodation. I think there's something amazing about being higher up in town, able to look over the street. And it's funny, we made this film. This is an earlier version, not the final version. And not many people have really seen it because we don't have a system within our planning process that allows us to exchange these sort of pieces of information, which I think is a bit of a shame. Sorry. Gordon Cullen advocates us seeing the world in more detail. I think this is really important. I think it's the difference between looking and seeing, and you have to train yourself to sort of appreciate things that are around you, particularly if the things around you are quite ordinary. Two artists that I enjoy being in touch with definitely see the world in detail. Isaac Cordell makes people, not places, and Frank Kunert makes places and not people, never the other way round. Isaac Cordell is Spanish and makes people from cement. Men in suits, often perched precariously on the wiring that seems to cover most Spanish buildings. His work is sort of melancholy, and it seems to suggest that modern urban life is too much for people. He deals with big topics using his small figures. Here, I think, drawing attention to global warming in a very sort of evocative way, but always these pieces are placed in a place that you understand, so they kind of, they're sort of part of the place, albeit temporarily. Frank Kunert's work is more about ironic humour and painstaking detail. There's everything you need here to live, but it's obviously impossible to use. I don't know if that's a commentary on legislation, space standards, but I find his work very amusing. Yeah. So A Place in the Sun, he kind of sees absurdity in new architecture. You know, modernism bullying dilapidation. And it took me a couple of takes to realise that the joke is really the projecting modern balcony making the dilapidated balcony completely unusable. I love it. But, you know, he spends months making these models. They're quite large, actually. And he was a professional photographer, so he photographs these models. But in his studio, you can see literally all there is a facade. You know, it's completely about the picture. So we've been looking at a site in Havre de Pars, and this pair of houses nearby caught my eye with their narrow, awkward rear extensions and rough cast render. I don't know if they probably need to be let in, do they? Oh, maybe not. And yes, it's become a bit of a fascination of mine. We think of Jersey being kind of characterised by granite, and of course it is in many beautiful ways, but actually by far the most prevalent material we've got is render. And I was kind of interested in how far we could push render in a way in terms of its patterning and texture. On the right is a piece of work by a friend of mine who's a sculptor, and I was attracted to the idea of these kind of crosses being on buildings. I don't know quite why, but yeah, Havre de Pars has probably got the most exuberant decorative stucco in Jersey. I mean, and I thought, could these patterns and textures be celebrated in a contemporary way, perhaps? A little bit of Spain creeping in the right there. But the middle this kind of fan-shaped render, I think it is, was popular in the 1930s, and there's quite a few examples of it around the island. And, you know, okay, maybe not as easy to see beauty in this as at first. I mean, the flush plastic windows don't help. But the composition and cracks, the texture in the rainwater pipe, I think make it quite intriguing to me as a composition. A conversation I had with Stuart was about accidentalism in design. And I think one of the things that I really enjoy is trying to find that happy accident where something is composed in a way that perhaps doesn't feel as obvious as it might do. So we've been looking at ways of adding shapes and ornamentation to flat walls. Here we've got deck access walkways which are elevated to try and look like frontages so that, you know, they're not the standard kind of horizontal layer, but something more vertical. And of course, got a bit of Frank Kunert in here. He has his own ideas about overlooking, I think. But, so, facade movement, verticality, layering, and on the right, just an elegantly proportioned Spanish substation. I kind of saw that and thought it really kind of reminded me of the way I'd been thinking about this particular project. And there was a sort of something complementary about it. It's actually very beautifully detailed as well. It was clearly a great sense of pride in providing electricity around Spain when it was built. This is kind of an idea for a very low-rise scheme, compact living. Could be a garden end unit, could be not only terraced but back-to-back. So if you're in a situation where height's not really an option, it's a great way to get density. But I think also creating homes that have a sense of spaciousness to them. So it was something we were looking at briefly. And let's end topically again with a postcard. It's been a fantastic project idea to have a postcard, and of course I immediately wanted to find a really contrived acronym, which I managed to do in Dadaism. But the kind of idea is to look back from the future to Jersey, and it's a sort of commentary on our kind of increasingly bureaucratic world we live in. You know, we're all creative people. Architecture Week has come around and everybody's excited about design. But after that, there's another 2 years of struggle with, you know, not being able to have conversations about important things and directorates. And so I imagined that there could be a directorate for delight, there could be a directorate for accidentalism, and there could be a directorate for decoration. And I thought they'd be good departments to have. You could go and chat to them, and who knows, you might come up with something quite interesting. And a sort of, obviously the Dadaists were anti-establishment, so there's a degree of protest in there, I guess, without a doubt. And yeah, I just kind of started to think about three-dimensional postcards, and kind of like Frank Kunert in a way, the idea of unworkable architecture. There's no client, there's no constraints whatsoever, so you can do what you want. So why not try and do something that just doesn't work? It might be quite liberating, I thought. And sort of an imagined future, but partly rooted in the past. Diving board balcony on the right there. And I don't know, there's a sort of maybe a happier world than Isaac Cordell's slightly desperate world, but one that I think could possibly be complementary. It was actually just great to be making models and making something without constraints too. People, trees and words living happily together. Experimenting with pattern and ornamentation. And maybe this could be thisness. And giving Frank Kunert the very last laugh. He's very serious about fun. Thank you very much.
Mike, just a question about clients. Where would you find clients who would take this on and engage with the ideas you're putting across?
They'll be in 2040.
2040, okay.
I think there might be a need for change in the way we think about how we live in town. Obviously, a lot of the ideas I've shown here aren't necessarily scalable, so they're not going to be possible for the bigger sites. But I do think there's an idea around adding more finesse to large-scale projects, adding something more. And I feel that it's an area that interests me, the idea of layering in bigger buildings, the idea of using salvage, the idea of, sounds heretical to an architect, but using colour more. And that potentially could involve using artists, because they're probably much better at that. And the idea that, in my head, St Helier needs to be more vertical than horizontal, if that makes sense.
I don't quite follow that.
The grain, I think, like this building, the grain of St Helier is much more vertical traditionally. And I think contemporary architecture might want to think about that.
Like, we're talking in 3 weeks on these sort of themes, and I was walking around town today looking at some of the things you've mentioned there for a walk on Friday of this week. And many of the same things come across, that the more closely you look at buildings and building elements, the more exciting the environment appears. But everyone's just rushing around so much, they don't take time to look at detail. That's most important. Once you start doing that, you see what a wonderful town St Helier is, despite the damage it's taken. So these ideas, I think, are absolutely coming into their own in the next few years. Hopefully will do.
I think that's right. I mean, I've spent quite a lot of time walking around the lanes of St Helier, and I'd recommend everybody to do it. Just take an afternoon off and just potter. It's amazing what you see. Amazing. You think you know it because you've seen it, but actually, when you do spend time looking properly, you find all sorts of absolutely amazing nuggets of kind of quirky buildings and accidental kind of compositions in facades and things that you perhaps can't really work out how they've happened, but they're there. Lots of surprises.
Hello? Is that working? Okay, I'll just speak loud. Oh, it's for that. Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry. Okay. Really enjoyed that talk, Mike. Thank you.
Thank you.
And actually picking up on what Stuart's saying, and I really enjoyed those examples from St Helier. And I love the idea of a big project. And I just think about the AJA and like what you've shown me today. Actually, I didn't know those places. They're so unique, and they kind of give a flavour of qualities and conditions on the island that I think maybe are not obvious to many people. And I wonder what the picture people have of the kind of what Jersey should be like, or what's in a planner's mind of what the appropriate like qualities a place should have in the future. And there's some sort of richness that you can get from just looking at what we have and just understanding it, to kind of start a dialogue over trying to bring up the ideas that you're interested in here, which I think are connected. And maybe I think about Gordon Cullen's book, and that's a great kind of study of English towns, but it's not Jersey. And I wonder how we can, I don't know, bring this out. Like, it's like when you draw for yourself the site of a new project. At that point, no one's drawn a map of that site ever. You know, that's the best map of that house and that site that's ever been made. And we don't necessarily have that for Jersey, of an understanding of the Jersey townscape. And I wonder if we need that, because the references we have are UK, it's England. It's from a different context altogether. So I don't know, I wonder, it's like a slow burn project, but to kind of to this question of educating people, and whether that can be something that you think is important, or like how do you bring people on board? I guess that's my question.
Yeah, that's a good question too. I mean, I think obviously Gordon Cullen studied English townscapes, but I think a lot of the thinking is still solid for anywhere. So that's one good thing. It seems to me that we're in a world where it's increasingly difficult to have a conversation, a creative conversation with decision makers, other people, and I feel part of what we need to do is to rediscover the ability of actually having a dialogue. actually doing what you're saying, actually walking around the sites, talking about these issues. And I think everybody would be hugely impressed with how productive that would be. And I feel we have a system to a certain extent where we do things in vacuums and we do things in isolation. And you know, if anything has been fantastic about the last few weeks, it's been the Architecture Week exhibition where lots of different folk have got together and made something happen. And you know, it wasn't by accident. It took hard work, it took communication, it took collaboration. Sometimes we didn't quite know where we were going, but we got there. And that almost is a template for, I think, how we could benefit from rethinking how we progress projects. Because you're right, Stuart's right, we're rushing around like crazy things constantly, there's pressures everywhere. Architecture's a real struggle. There are so many variables, so many things you have to try and satisfy, that quite often maybe we all take our eye off the ball about what's important.
I'll just pick up on some of that, because one thing occurred to me recently about what characterises St Helier in particular is the constant innovation, year by year, new buildings coming along, until probably post-war years. But there's a huge wealth of different sorts of buildings, mostly quite small in the town centre. They're not mega sites, but it's so rich in inventiveness and innovation. But you only get to see that and understand it by looking closely. I think that is the way forward. We keep on innovating, we try new things, and we add richness to the environment of the whole island. Much of the architecture is British inspiration or English inspiration. A wee bit is French, but the rest of it's sheer inventiveness of individual people who are designing and putting things into sites.
And I think obviously there's a lot to see on the lanes, but there's also an awful lot tucked away in difficult places. I mean, I've got a carbon fibre telescopic pole with a camera on it, and it goes up 10 metres. It's not a drone, but it gives you a different perspective on what you're looking at. So the Dorset Street project we looked at, there was this amazing network of kind of disused gardens that filled the heart of a triangular site. And our proposal was to hook all that out and build a sort of new street through there with a low-scale kind of series of buildings. And you're right, you don't get to see those things so easily. So I think some aerial kind of observation might be very useful too. There are also some incredible kind of, I suppose, almost homemade roof terraces and places that people have colonised to get a bit of outdoor space, and I find those fascinating. You know, they're just tucked away and they're not been designed at all. They probably don't comply with any regulations, but I love the idea that people have carved them out to grab a bit of sunshine or a view.
Mike, what has happened to that scheme?
Oh, it got refused.
What?
It got refused.
It got refused by planning?
Yeah.
What was the reason?
Well, there are a few reasons. Too tall was one. The environment in the courtyard was deemed to be too intimate. So we're just weighing up what we do. We might perhaps go back to the committee and see what they think. We might appeal it. I don't know.
Well, it was disappointing because, as you know, well, you presented it, and the Architecture Commission was very supportive.
Yes.
Wasn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
Because it had charm.
Yeah.
So it's disappointing that someone else has decided that, well, an officer has decided that it's not acceptable, and it didn't go to a committee, in my view. The client was supportive, were they?
Very supportive, yeah. Yeah, we were 2 years, it was a 2-year process. So, and we had good dialogue, but one particular case officer left the island and that stalled. And so, as I said before, it's frustrating because I'm sure that through having dialogue and conversations and exploring the site together, you can make a lot of progress.
I was just going to make, as I've got this here, I'll just make one more point, which is that, I mean, I think thisness is fantastic, and absolutely what it's all about. There's a general assumption that conservation areas are a bad thing and stand in the way of innovation, for instance, or new buildings. But one thing they do is introduce a level of characterization of areas and understanding of thisness at a formal level, which is then fully understood and set out So I think in a strange way they could be helpful towards the introduction and stitching together of new things like your Dorset Street scheme, which would imagine would be accepted in a conservation area. I don't see why it should not be, actually, because it's responsive. So I think it would be strange sometimes for architects to think that conservationists or building heritage people might be actually on the same page when it comes to thisness, but I think that is the case.
I totally agree. I think conservation areas are a great idea. I've always thought that what would be interesting about them is to, as you say, safeguard the kind of character of an area as seen from the public, but have a sort of slightly more relaxed hand when it comes to internal spaces that aren't seen. So you could develop this kind of really interesting contrast between very familiar, comfortable streetscapes and then stuff going on within the sites that could be very different. And I think it's an interesting constraint. And what I love about Frank Kuhnert's models is the thing he really, really does well and spends so much time doing is kind of getting his models to have this veneer of history, to look tatty, to look like they're distressed. And he painstakingly puts rust on things, and it's a great thing. And the truth is that very often is what characterizes interesting places. I think decay is a very sort of interesting topic.
Thank you. Two questions. First, a quick observation. You mentioned Peter Barber, I think, and there's a lot of Peter Barber about some of your schemes, but also Panther Hudspeth, which you obliquely mentioned. Mark's a friend of mine. I just wondered if you could say a little bit more about some of the references there. Yeah. But mainly I want to talk about verticality, which I completely agree with you, that there's a certainly verticality about a Georgian town or a Victorian town and the proportions of the windows, and it's one thing that came up, for instance, in a design critique when another UK firm who I know well, Howarth Tompkins, produced the proposal for the building in Lamotte. Is it Lamotte Street? Yes, the currently a Government of Jersey building, but was originally it was a bank building. Can't remember which bank at the moment, but was presented with horizontal fenestration. And at the time, this would be back in the 80s, 80s/90s. The planning department did have a team of architects that or external architects brought along to give a design review, an early forerunner, if you like, of the JAC. And my father's late partner Eric Baker was on the architects panel, and he took one look at the drawings and said they're wrong. Your glazing, your 6 stories of patent glazing, should have a vertical emphasis, not a horizontal emphasis. That's the thisness, if you like, of Jersey and St Helier. So yes, verticality is something that we should cherish and respect.
Yeah, so I suppose to answer your question on Panther Hudspeth, I just really admired they've done some schemes in London where they're able to kind of create movement and break up quite big facades, I think, in a really kind of human scale way. And what interested me about their work is it's a way of scaling up a building to 4, 5, even 6 stories. Yet I think still trying to sort of keep a feeling that it's made of pieces that people can understand and imagine, almost putting their arms out and sort of grabbing. The Lamotte Street offices, I'd just come to Jersey, I think they were either completing or just completed. And they were clearly a step change in terms of architectural quality of their day, I think, and they still are. It's a fantastic scheme. I recollect that it was approved on the back of an existing 9-story building that was demolished to make way for them. So there was quite a lot of planning gain, but I think it's a very, very well finessed building.
Hi, I really enjoyed the talk. So I wanted to ask a question about, so it's kind of touching on the idea of thisness and some of the references, some of the photographs earlier on in the presentation. And I think you were identifying the richness is a lot of reading the history and the evolution of a place or a space over time. And I think the scheme that's on the projector now, what's rich about it is the fact that it's not static and that it can reflect the use and that moment in time. So my question is, how do you bridge the gap between providing a static scheme and then trying to achieve thisness or something that can evolve and develop over time?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I don't know whether it's because I wasn't very good at dates at school, but I always hated history. One of my sons absolutely loves it, and it's all brought to life. But I prefer the term memory, personally. And I found it, I think remembering people is quite an interesting way to characterize places. And that's kind of why I was so fascinated to find out about some of the people that lived in the streets we were looking at and what they did and where they came from. I mean, to think that Jersey was kind of in the mid-19th century full of kind of political refugees and dissidents and people who, you know, the French government were getting really nervous about because they were right, you know, a very short distance from their shores. So the British government had to exile 50-odd people from Jersey, including Victor Hugo, just to keep the French happy. He eventually ended up in Guernsey and was okay. So I really like the idea of, and it's a struggle because it's very difficult to find information about things, but I love the idea of, you know, trying to think about who lived in a place before, what happened before, as a sort of, if that's a historic reference, then yes. And what was the other part of your question, sorry?
Designing something that is not frozen in time, so it's something that can evolve and kind of achieve thisness to reflect the time as it goes by.
Yeah, so I mean, this is a big change, I think, for a lot of people, that I think architects were the sort of perfect conductors of an orchestra. Every note had to be in place, everything had to be white and shiny and very ordered. And there's a sort of, I think, like this is another way of thinking about things, and that is that you're only part of a process. You're not in charge of it all. You can't actually decide everything. And once you actually clue into the idea that, you know, a little bit of accidentalism could enrich the scheme, everything changes, because people's concerns about public engagement, co-design, they evaporate because you're kind of not really necessarily trying to entirely control the finished product. And so I really like the idea that you might call it quirkiness, but something is as a result of lots of people thinking about it and putting ideas in there. And you're quite right, I think creating something that has the capacity to allow future change, modification, personalization adds to it. You know, I think there's a classic discussion around balconies, and the second you finish a development, people put split cane to make themselves private, and someone puts an owl on a stick or whatever it is. And that's absolute heresy, isn't it? Of course, it was. I don't think it is so much anymore. I quite like the idea that folk do that. But what would be even more interesting is to try and, as I think you're suggesting, find ways within the design to be able to encourage that and make it more part of the kind of end product.
Hello, Mike.
Hi, man.
Just continuing on the theme of references, I noticed that there seems to me to be a lot of references to both aesthetically and materially to the Iberian Peninsula, and I just wondered where these references come from, you know, from within yourself, because I know that you take an interest in Jersey's maritime history, and as you know, in the past there were a lot of trade between this place and the Iberian Peninsula via the cod trade. And of course we also have a Portuguese diaspora living here now in the third generation. So I just wondered if these references are something that, the historical references to that kind of context is something that influences your design decisions, including some of these ideas into the things you've shown us tonight.
Some did, Martin. I mean, when we did Minden Place, as you know, we got very excited about that cod triangle, Jersey exporting bricks out to Canada and doing all of that stuff. But we also spend time in Spain, and I'm always amazed at how the Spanish seem to be able to live better than we do. You know, they stay up really late, they go to work late, they have a sleep in the afternoon, and their streets are really civilized. And I think, you know, maybe it's the weather, but I have this image in my head that the lanes of St Helier were obviously quite Victorian. People didn't need balconies, they went to work and did this and that. So they're quite, in a way, they're quite reflective of that, whereas the Spanish streets are much more to do with obviously protection from the weather, but outdoor space as well. And yeah, maybe I need to get it out of my system a bit, but it's a little bit of a thing that's been rattling around in my head for a while now. And then I love the idea that Spanish buildings have got great metalwork, you know, really nice artisanal metalwork. They use tiles and things, and kind of things that, I mean, decoration's been a bit of a dirty word in my early architectural career, I think. And it's creeping into, it's not just my vocabulary, I think it's happening in a lot of areas. That you know, we're starting to think, well, actually, why not? Why not splash some colour? Why not have some splashes of decorative metalwork or tiling or whatever it is? And if that becomes part of a story, it becomes a bit more interesting, Martin. And that's where that kind of idea of the Battle of Trafalgar and the Peninsular War, I was actually completely amazed that those people will be living there, you know, in St Helier, and you know, the idea that, you know, maybe they did meet each other. I mean, it would be incredible that two soldiers from, well, obviously Spain kind of swapped sides halfway through the war, didn't they? But so maybe that's would have made the meeting a little easier. But the idea that all of that kind of was going on, big things in the world were going on, but they ended up as smaller things in very small lanes in the middle of St Helier. It fascinates me. And like I say, I've struggled to find more of those connections, but I really do enjoy that. And you know, sometimes it just takes you in a direction that's a little bit unexpected, and I think that's a positive thing.
Can I just pick up on that and just ask you, I just wondered if you know, considering the population that lives in St Helier, predominantly a large proportion are Portuguese, which comes from the Iberian Peninsula, you know, through their own heritage. And I just wondered if you, in somebody thinking about the communities that some of these buildings might serve, does that play into some of the ideas you have in decision making?
It hasn't done, but it's a fascinating idea to try and connect into that and see where it led. Right.
So I guess step counts quickest. So I suppose, well, thank you very much
Pleasure.
for that,
Thank
Mike.
you.
I think that's been the lanes of St Helier are just pure joy. So, and if you're ever, when it's hot again in the summer, just walk around and it's amazing. You hear everyone having their parties in the reefs. So, thank you very much, Mike. That was brilliant.